Hi everyone. This is going to be your PowerPoint on the discussion of nature and nurture in psychology. You should have a basic understanding of DNA, and by basic, it's probably going to be far less than what you've ever need in a biology class. You don't need to know about replication, splitting, anything like that. Know basic terminology and really what it points to. So when we talk about things like chromosomes, you should understand that each cell carries 46 chromosomes, your blueprint, that you get 23 from mom, 23 from dad. That equals a total of 46. So obviously the sex cells, sperm and eggs, they carry 23 chromosomes. The reason chromosomes will become important is that we do have disorders that exist when there is a extra chromosome present. The most common would be Down syndrome. When we look at what a gene is, it's a biochemical unit. So essentially this is going to be the different pairing up that we have that give us different expression. So when we say something is genetic, it's because there's an expression that came from either one pairing or several pairings of genes that cause the expression. With a term like DNA, you should know that it's the double helix. Essentially, it's the organization of all of our genes that make up the unique person that you are. When we're looking at the genome, if we look at what makes you you versus anyone sitting next to you in class or halfway across the planet, we have a 99.9% match genetically to all other humans, meaning that it's about a 0.1% that causes the variations that we see between each other. And truly, that makes a lot of sense since we all have the same internal organs, our systems operate all the same way. Really, it's just visual external expression that we really see the difference in height, hair color, skin color, those kind of very simple expressions. Again, this just takes those concepts and puts it back into a little bit more order for you. So in every cell, we have a nucleus. In the nucleus, you have your chromosomes. Your chromosomes are going to have strands of DNA, and within the DNA, you're going to have pairs of genes. You guys should have an idea of heterozygous and homozygous conditions. Anytime you see the word homo, it means same. Anytime you see the word hetero, it's going to mean different. So a homozygous condition would be something like blue-eyed, where you would have two recessive genes that cause the blue eye. There's nothing that can dominate them. If you have someone with brown eyes, then you have someone that might have a homozygous condition where they have two dominant genes, or there's the possibility that they might have the dominant brown eye gene and they may carry the blue eye recessive gene, meaning that there's still a good chance that they could have kids with blue eyes. Most of our traits are polygenetic, meaning that they are influenced by more than just one pair of genes. Going back to the blue eyes are a mutation. So this was way back a random error in gene replication. It caused a different eye color because it was going to be found as either unique or desirable for some reason. You see that blue eyes became something that was replicated. So anytime you see differences in people, hair color, eye color, height, etc., usually that meant that there had to have been a mutation along the way. You guys should know Mendel. Honestly, you're not going to see him on a test for me, and you're probably not going to see him on an AP exam, but it is worth noting that he is going to be the person who really kind of is credited with our understanding of genetics. You guys have probably done plenty of these squares before. Just understand that when we're looking at this one, the big yellow pea pod is the dominant and the little y's or the green pea pods are the recessive. And so whatever is dominant is expressed unless it is a homozygous condition and you have two of the little green pea pods. You do need to know the difference between what a genotype is and a phenotype. So your genotype is your genetics. That means that you might not necessarily see it, but a phenotype, well, that's the physical. So that's going to be what we observe. Here you have something like detached earlobes. That means that the lobe of your ear actually kind of swings free from your head. Some people have it, some people don't. Well, an attached earlobe is a recessive trait, detached is a dominant trait, and here you have the Punnett square that will set it up for you. Now, if we were in class, we could sit here and go through this entire scenario. It's really honestly not worth too much discussion, except for, is it possible for a blue-eyed couple to have a brown-eyed child? And here's the crazy thing about genetics. We can't say it's impossible. There is the chance that there might be a genetic hiccup. So We do have some weird things that happen genetically. We have people who are called chimeras, where their children don't have the same DNA as the parent. So they don't carry any of the maternal DNA. And that's just a really, really strange kind of abnormality that comes with genetics. So with science, we want everything to be reasonable, rational, predictable, and we're humans. And so reasonable, rational, and predictable don't always follow, even when we're talking about, the laws of genetics. So what we're going to talk about now is evolutionary psychology. This actually came about in the 1980s, and that is not a typo, 1980, not the 1890s. Now, anytime we think of evolution, we immediately go back to Darwin, and that would have been the 1890s. But evolutionary psychology wanted to look at how certain behaviors exist globally. In other words, that there are going to be some things that are just part of how we evolved as a species. Now, when we're looking at this all is coming from a book that I read called Why Beautiful People Have More Daughters. And it is an entire book about evolutionary psychology, which if you ever get really bored or turn into a giant psychology nerd, I would encourage you to read it. It's very interesting. But it sits there and it makes four really decent claims that you have to think about. One, as humans, we like to think that we're exempt from biology, but we can't be. We're part of the natural kingdom. So there is a biological explanation for human behavior. We also like to think that somehow evolution stops at the neck. So like from the head up, we've evolved because we have technology and our world has changed. But, we'll still carry around organs that we don't really need anymore, or pinky toes that don't really do anything for us. And the reality is that no, our brains haven't evolved. We haven't met the criteria for evolution. That human nature is a blank slate, and that it really is just our current environment that creates us. And the reality is that we do have some innate behaviors. There are some things that just are part of literally the landscape of who we are, of the entire species of people. And human behavior is a product almost entirely of environment and socialization. That can't be true. Some of it is DNA. You don't have to memorize any of these, but these help explain what we're going to talk about in the next upcoming slides. So we look at human behavior and we want to understand why we behave the way we do, how the human brain has adapted to solve problems of survival and reproduction. That's the heart of evolutionary psychology. So why do we like sweets everywhere, globally? It may not be your favorite thing, but we all have a preference for sweeter foods. It might not be chocolate, it might not be ice cream, it might be fruit, but there is a biological preference for sweets. And the answer for that is that for a very long time ago, when it was hunter-gatherer times, anything that was sweet was high in calories. If it was high in calories, it meant that when we were walking for miles a day, when food was scarce, that these would have been sources of energy for us that would have been there for a long time, so hence a lot of fruits. But what we have now is something, if you skip down to the Savannah principle, the human brain has difficulty comprehending and dealing with entities and situations that do not exist, or that did not exist in the ancestral environment. Essentially, there was no supermarket in the ancestral environment. There was no grocery store, there was no 7-Eleven, there was nowhere to go where you could just pop in and grab a candy bar. So now in our current environment, we have all of this sugar, all of these calories readily available to us, and our brain craves them, but we don't know how to necessarily deal with that. And so we have obesity. We have this biological craving for it because it's set up for something that is, a world 10,000 years ago. The reason that this hasn't erased itself is that for evolution to take place, you need several generations in an unchanging environment. So it's a slow process. It has to be shared by the entire species, and we just haven't had that. We haven't changed since the ice ages. Here's a quick breakdown for natural selection. A stable, unchanging environment for many generations. And usually when they're talking about many generations, they're talking about 50 generations. 50. So we have roughly about 3 generations every 100 years. maybe 4 if you're really quick on the reproducing. So we went from hunter-gatherer to agrarian to industrial to post-industrial in about 10,000 years. We never had a stable environment long enough that we could actually selectively remove genetic traits or behaviors that were no longer going to support us. Evolutionary psychology will also look at some things like what we find for reproductive desirability. So men everywhere prefer attractive physical features suggesting youth and health, which will explain the next one. Now notice this is global. It's not looking at the United States. It's looking everywhere. Every culture, everywhere, youth and health. Now everyone says beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's true. But when men look for partners, they're looking for youth and health, whatever that might be for their culture. So when people make that concept or the statement that, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, my question is, if we go to something like the Miss Universe pageant, and here you have Venezuela, Korea, Brazil, the United States, and Japan, and you have a range of different colors, but ultimately they look pretty much the same. Long shiny hair, healthy glowing skin, they seem rather in shape and healthy. Now we're going to talk about Barbie. Now, there are going to be reasons that the numbered parts are going to show preference on an evolutionary level. You have to remember that through this conversation, we're talking about evolutionary psychology, so this is going to be universals throughout the world. You're going to have to remember this is going to be justifications prior to medical science or cosmetics. And the purpose for all of this is to find a suitable partner for reproduction. And that's a big one. What makes this person a suitable partner for reproduction? So long hair. Long hair, when we look at reproduction, that doesn't really tie in well, except for the fact that when you realize that long hair is usually an indication of health. As you get sick, nutrients usually deplete from the nails and the hair first. So someone with long, silky, healthy looking hair is probably also physiologically healthy. Large breasts. They're going to be an indication of youth. So again, a long time ago, hotter climates, when there were people who were probably not wearing shirts and definitely not wearing bras because they hadn't been invented yet, you didn't have things like a driver's license, you didn't have things like birth certificates. And so to indicate someone's youth, if you looked at them without their shirts on, which again, hot climates would have been very common, women with larger breasts, eventually gravity would take over, and larger breasts sag with age. Women with smaller breasts, it would have been harder to calculate their age based off of that one trait. Blonde hair. It's an indication of youth. Anyone, brunette or blonde, when they're younger, their hair is lighter, and as they get older, it becomes darker. If you were in a colder climate where you couldn't necessarily look at breasts, hair color may have been a better indicator. The lighter the hair, the more likely that that person was young, and so that would have become a desirable trait. So as you go further north, especially Nordic countries, there's a pretty good explanation why we see a large concentration of blondes and redheads. Small waist. This is going to be an indication of health. And again, you think of distended bellies, you're talking about people who are probably either starving or have some other kind of health related issue. Women with a low ratio of waist to hip, they tended to be more fertile. So again, that small waist would have been more desirable. Blue eye preference. Now this is one that they're not 100% certain of, but it is been kicked around. And they think that blue eye preference may have been a good indicator for arousal. So you're looking for a partner, you want to make sure that the partner is receptive. Well, something crazy happens when you are attracted to somebody. Your pupils will start to dilate. Well, with lighter eyes, it's easier to see the pupil change. It's harder to see that with people with dark brown eyes. So all of these together kind of explain why there is a preference for the kind of Barbie standard. When we talk about Darwin, we are not going to get into evolution or the discussion about whether evolution happened or didn't happen. What we want to do is we want to just have this idea of survival of the fittest, taking on our best traits and passing them off to the next generations. What we're going to look more at is a term called adaptation. The traits that we get, the inherited characteristics in a species that help it solve a problem or help it reproduce. So it's a refined theory, but it's still very much similar to Darwin's original theory. How do we adapt to our environments? What do we use or utilize? Who is the best at surviving or producing offspring based in those situations? Behavior genetics, know the definition. We are not going to spend too much time actually discussing behavior genetics. So it's going to look at genetic factors and your behavioral factors. So we're going to look at how your genetics have interplay with your environment. And really kind of my favorite example of this one is you may have the potential to be a great athlete or a great musician. That might genetically be part of who you are. You have an ear for music and counting and rhythm, and it's just in you. You have great coordination, reflex, and muscle memory, so you might be a really good athlete. But if you're never given a piano or you're never given a baseball bat or a hockey stick, you're not going to express that. So it is an interplay between your environment and what's provided to you to experience and your genetics and what sets you up for it. So your environment is going to be every non-genetic influence, starting in your prenatal development, and it will also include all the people around you in your life. One of the things that we have that is very much genetically based is your temperament. Being short-tempered or easygoing, those are kind of the two extremes on the continuum of temperament. But most of us have a level of emotional reactivity or intensity. We get really fired up, or when other people are really fired up, we're kind of, not necessarily feeling it. That's just going to be who you are. Now, the crazy thing is temperament is evident almost at birth. And I say almost at birth, but as you get to know your baby, you see their temperament. And I always laugh because my mom, when I was younger, wished that one day I would have a daughter just like me. And I have a daughter just like me. So my daughter has just a fiery temper. Her temperament has been that way ever since she was little. It will be that way until the day that she dies. She has a fiery temper. Now, you may sit there and go, I'm short-tempered too. Just remember that genetics don't determine everything. So she has a short temper, but I'm teaching her how to hopefully modify the expression of the short temper. Now, another term that you guys should know is heritability. And heritability is not inheritance. We're not going to talk about what you inherited from mom and dad. When we talk about heritability, we're talking about roughly the proportion of a certain genetic trait within a group of people. So it's going to depend on the range of populations and the environment studied. So we're talking about if we look at this one genetic trait in the United States versus Canada, we're looking at ranges of populations, environments where we see certain behaviors pop up or certain genetically attributable responses pop up. That's going to be heritability. It is different than inheritance. Again, with behavior genetics, we're talking about the interaction, which goes back to the example I previously gave you. If we're looking at molecular genetics, they're going to start actually looking at your genomes, figuring out exactly what kind of unique cocktail of genes got put together to make up your behavior. We will talk about family studies, adoption studies, and twin studies. All three of these you should know. With family studies, we're going to look at how children are similar and different to their parents, how children are similar and different to their siblings, to their cousins, and so on and so forth. The closer your genetic relation, the more you should see similarities. So siblings should be more alike than cousins. When we look at something like schizophrenia, it has a 1% chance occurrence in the entire population, but it increases if you have a sibling or a parent that exhibits the same disorder. So often we'll use family studies as an indication of whether or not traits run in a family. But again, this is correlational. Here you have roughly the breakdown. Now this explains why identical twins are so fascinating to study. If they're identical twins, they have the same DNA. And so their degree of relatedness is 100%, which means when we look at things like intelligence, personality traits, it is a really good group of people to study because if they replicate themselves in both people, we can make a very strong statement about their relationship. Next, we will look at fraternal twins. So same environment their entire lives, but different DNA, because fraternal twins are no more similar than any other brother and sister, or brother and brother, or sister and sister. And we'll also look at parent-child, and so on and so forth down the list. With twin studies, know the difference between what monozygotic and dizygotic means. So mono, one, identical twins come from the same fertilized egg, which means they start out with the same 46 chromosomes. They split into two separate people with the same exact start point. So they have the same DNA. Fraternal twins, however, get a different egg and a different sperm. They just share the same environment. When we look at heredity, identical twins, again, 100% the same genetic information. They have either the same or what we would say is a very similar environment. That is one of the big questions we have, though, is when we're looking at this is, do kids get the exact same environment? And anyone who has a brother or a sister, you can make a strong argument for no, that you don't always get treated the same. Fraternal twins, they have the exact same environment, so to say, from the minute they're conceived, and they have the same degree of relationship, but this idea that they've been in the same environment, prenatal is an interesting thing to kind of also bring into this discussion. Adoption studies are going to be important because when we don't have a lot of identical twins or other scenarios that we can look at, something very interesting happens with adoption studies. You have a child who's going to be raised by somebody that does not share any of their genetics. And so what we can tell from that is as the child grows, if they show high levels of correlation in attitudes or behaviors or expression to that of their biological parent, it probably is something very genetically based. But if it's more like that of their adoptive parent, it is probably more environmentally influenced. Separated twins are being studied by the University of Minnesota, and they have been collecting information on twins that have been separated and reunited later, and they look again at things like intelligence, personality, things as basic as heart rate and brain waves, and they continue to find that identical twins seem to match up more closely regardless of where they were raised than any other group. Told you guys at the onset of this that genetics, especially that idea of 46, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, that's a very important thing to remember. This is one of the genetic disorders that you must know. So Down syndrome, you have what's called trisomy 21. It's an extra chromosome. So instead of 46, there's going to be 47. This is going to be one of the leading causes of mental and social delay in children. Often we will diagnose later if they are unable to care for themselves, low IQs. We'll say that this is a diagnosable form of mental retardation. And you should have an idea of the widely recognized appearance. So when we're looking at children with Down syndrome, you're going to see usually more flattened features on the face, the almond shaped or slanted eyes. They're going to have a deeper crease in their hand, and then you're going to see widely splayed toes between the first and the second. And today you actually will go in, and while you're pregnant, they will do a test for it. Currently the test for Down syndrome is shaky at best. It's just slightly above 50% accuracy, or at least it was 8 years ago when I had my daughter. My doctor basically told me that to get a positive would only be an indication that you have to go for a follow-up test. The follow-up test is really kind of scary. It's called an amniocentesis. They have to take a very long needle and extract amniotic fluid from the uterus to actually test the genes in that fluid, what is floating around. So essentially the stem cells. And then they can give you a positive. There is no good early test. So it's something that can happen to anyone. There is a greater increase the older you are that you get pregnant. So after about the age of 35, it goes up to a 1% chance, and then every year after that, the chance increases. It doesn't mean that you cannot have this when you're 22 or 25 or 29. We do know that with age of either parent, the chances of genetic abnormalities increase. Turner syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome, these are also chromosomal. You guys really don't need to know this outside of just a general idea. So Turner syndrome, female doesn't have the usual pair of 2X chromosomes. They might have what's called a partial or an incomplete. Approximately a third of them have both of their X chromosomes, but part of it's detached. About half will have just a single chromosome. This is essentially the idea that genetically there's going to be some things missing. 90% of them are going to be non-reproductive. But again, that doesn't mean that, there are going to be some that have Turner syndrome and are still able to have children. Klinefelter is the presence of an extra X chromosome in males. So instead of XY, you have XXY. This one, it becomes more debilitating as they get older. So as babies, they're going to be smaller in birth weight. Muscle development and motor control is going to be a little bit delayed. As they get older, they're going to have increased social and learning disabilities. Their body proportions are going to be kind of abnormal, and they may not be able to be reproductive. Last little chunk that we have to talk about, environment and its influence on behavior. So this previous section that we were talking about really was talking all about the entire nature discussion. What is part of you? And now we're getting into the nurture. How does your environment influence you? Your very first environment happened the minute you were conceived. So it's going to be the womb or the uterus. We will look at twins to see how this first environment can often impact them. Identical twins can actually have two different possible setups. They may share a placenta, and a placenta is an organ that is grown by women who are pregnant, and it helps filter out what we'll call teratogens, any kind of damaging viruses or bacterias or drugs or anything. It tries to strain that out from having contact with the infant. Now, we do know, though, that there are going to be certain viruses and certain drugs that can actually pass the placental barrier and impact the child. But with identical twins, they can have a single attachment and they both share the placenta, which means they have the exact same barrier, or they might have two different placentas. And here are the two different arrangements. Now, if you know anyone who is an identical twin, and fraternal twins always have the two placental arrangement because they came from two separate eggs. But if they shared the exact same, if it was two twins that were kind of in this arrangement, if they have the same placenta, they probably grow evenly. If they are not sharing the same placenta, you may have heard about one twin outgrowing the other or kind of being the bigger twin, and that might mean that they just had better placental arrangement, meaning that they had better access to nutrients. You guys read More Experience, Bigger Brains, and this essentially is the discussion about that. You had the option of two different rats, and again, you guys should have read about all the constraints, all the possible hiccups, all the problems, but you have the impoverished environment versus the enriched environment. What I want you to concentrate on is the rat brain cell. Now, on the left, you have the impoverished rat brain cell, and what you see is the dendrite has some branching and the axon has some branching, but it's not very large. Now, imagine that the neuron that is off to the right, that's going to be one that has had all of this stimulation. And think of stimulation as like water and sunlight for a plant. And notice the branching on the dendrite is far greater, and the branching on the axon is far greater. What that means is you have more hookups, more space, more areas for other neurons to communicate. And the axon is far reaching, so it has more axons it can send messages to. Environment helps stimulate the brain. Stimulation to the brain is like food and water. It is going to make it grow. We apply this to early child growth. You guys will read a lovely collection of case studies called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and there are a couple in there that really talk to this topic itself. We do know that with premature babies that they ask people to go in and to stroke their skin, to hold them skin to skin. They call it kangaroo care. And that just that skin to skin stimulation helps their brain grow. Hearing or feeling their mother's heart helps their brain grow. That's all information that's feeding into that one organ that then directs the rest of the body. When we want optimum brain development, it has to be early stimulation and normal stimulation in the early years. It is critical. That means hugging your children and holding them and giving them kisses and tickles and paying a lot of attention to them, not just putting them in front of televisions or technology, but human contact is important. Far more important in the early years than anything else. So it's that idea that you should overlove a baby. You cannot spoil an infant. Yes, you can spoil a 2-year-old. Yes, you can turn a 3-year-old into a complete jerk, but a newborn baby cannot be spoiled. The more love and the more attention you heap on them, the more their brain is going to connect and grow. Here you're looking at a fMRI. So we have a slide of the brain and we have the overlay of functioning, and we have what's going on in an untrained brain versus a trained brain. Now, if you remember, fMRI is oxygen consumption. That means that areas of the brain working. And it doesn't seem like it's that huge of a difference, but it is. So on the left brain, the untrained brain, there's this big gap and the brain is working, but it's obviously not working as efficiently. But here on the right brain, the trained brain, it's working and a huge area is engaged, and that means that there's a lot more going on. It doesn't mean that the brain is struggling, it means that the brain is active. A struggling brain is more often an inactive brain. An active brain is one that isn't struggling, it is using what it knows, it's operating, it's firing, it's doing what it's supposed to. So the more often you give yourself experience and a chance to learn something, you truly are growing connections in the brain. Your brain's not literally getting larger, but the connections are becoming more diverse and vast, and that's important. Peer influence. I love this one because peers influence everybody. It is not just a teen issue. It is an adult issue. It is a child issue. It is an everyone issue. So we select peers that are most like us. And I always ask this question, and I ask it in sociology and I ask it in psychology. If your best friend, your very best friend, were to jump off a bridge, would you do it too? Because remember, every parent, I think it's in our handbook, has to sit there and say, well, if so-and-so jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? And the answer for most of it is yes. So my very best friend, I've known her since I was 8. She lives right down the street from me now. Our sons are best friends. If she jumped off a bridge, I would, without thinking, jump off the exact same bridge. Here's why. I trust her. I trust her judgment. I trust the way that she thinks about the world. I know that she loves her son, so I'm guessing that the bridge that she's about to jump off of is going to be a very short footbridge. In fact, it might not even be a bridge. It might just be, a stair or two. I trust her. So we try to seek out people that we trust and that we identify with, which is why peer pressure can be pretty big, because when your peers, the people that you trust, make decisions, you almost just accept it because you accept them. Parents are also going to shape our lives, but here's the thing, and it's hard for me as a parent to say this, the shaping that we do is hard to see. It's usually very subtle. It's only very easily seen when you compare a very loved child to a very abused child. And so those differences usually only come out when we look at the extreme cases. What happens when we really are very horrible to children? Parents who are really good to their kids, they get normal kids and they get good kids. Good kids that do silly and stupid things sometimes, good kids that do the right things sometimes, but they get kids. It's when you look at the abuse that you see kind of the extremes. So your parents do influence you, they really do. The fact that you don't notice it means that they're probably doing a good job. When we also look at some other terms, we're going to look at culture. And that's going to be the country that you live in, the behaviors, the ideas, the traditions that you share with people. We'll use the word norm, which is basically just normal behavior, the understood rule of what you should do or expected in behavior, and just kind of have a general fluid idea of those terms. A couple other terms you should be familiar with, personal space. Literally that kind of imaginary bubble that surrounds you. Different cultures have different expectations of personal space. Americans, we kind of like to do what I would call the extended arm rule. If you can extend your arm out, nobody should be in that little bubble. However, you will allow people that you are very close to, and we'll use the term intimate, but you can be intimate with a friend. People that you trust and are very close to, they're allowed to join your bubble. They can come within that kind of 4-foot zone around your body. You guys should also be familiar with memes, self-replicating ideas. It'll include fashion, innovation, technology. It rapidly changes from person to person, time to time, and it will address the rapid changes that we have in our culture. And your generation has a new meme about every 15 seconds. Two other terms that you guys should use and be comfortable using will be individualism and collectivism. Individualistic culture versus a collectivist culture. So we are what we would call an individualistic culture. We give priority to the individual. So the way that I explain this is when you write your name, your first name comes first because that's who you are, and then you write your last name. When you're in school, you're responsible for your successes, but you're also responsible for your failures. In a collectivist society, it's not that everyone else is responsible, but everyone has a different perspective of their role. So in a collectivist society, usually they are going to have their last name first. So they would go last name, then first name. And the idea is that the group that they came from is more important than the individual that they are. And this is that idea of if you do something that is embarrassing or shameful, it's not just shameful and embarrassing to you, but to everyone that has tie into you. So that can be your parents or your school or whomever. And so to go back to that idea of who gets the pride when you succeed, well, it would be everybody. And when you fail, it's not that everyone fails, it's that it's not just the individual. The teachers, the parents, they all have a role in your success, so they then also have a role in the failure. We want to make sure that you guys understand X chromosome, Y chromosome. I feel like from our previous discussion, you should. X chromosome, you can only get one from mom, but you can get one from dad. Y chromosome, you can only get them from dad. And this will make sense when we get into discussions about things like color blindness. To be colorblind, it's more often in men because it's going to be what we'll call an X-linked trait. So if you have a Y chromosome from dad and your mom contributes an X-linked color blindness chromosome, then you're colorblind. It's far more rare to have a woman who's colorblind because she would need a X-linked trait from mom, and then she'd also have to have a dad with color blindness and also have an X-linked trait. So she would need both. So it's important just to have an idea of how those chromosomes kind of come into play. Testosterone, this is going to be a hormone that is produced by, wait for it, men and women, but mostly by men. Women, you have testosterone because you will bathe your fetus in testosterone if you want to have a male child. Well, not if you want, but if you're set up to have a male child. Again, for testosterone in males, it's going to stimulate male sex hormones. It's going to help grow the male sex organs when they're a fetus. It's going to develop all those weird, things, the deepening of the voice, the hairy faces, the extra sweat and smell during puberty, all of that fun stuff is going to come from testosterone. This page, I don't really go into too much. These are really terms that you should know. Role, a set of expectations. Gender is not your sex. Gender is what you identify with as the rules about being male and female. A gender role is the set of expectations. Gender identity is what you see yourself as. So none of this has to do with X or Y. This has to do with social constraints and what you feel. Gender typing is when you take on the role of being male or female. So really, it's just kind of a breakdown slowly of different terms and how they're utilized. If you want to, just pause it right here, read them over. But again, we're not going to spend too much time on those topics. Social learning theory. This is always fun because I see this with my kids a lot. Social learning theory we'll talk about a lot later. This is Albert Bandura's theory. And this is the theory that by observing others, we imitate their behaviors. And if the other person has been rewarded or punished, we either increase or decrease the behavior based off of what we've seen. So you have Billy, who was punished in class for talking, and the other students learn not to talk to avoid the punishment. So your environment can control behavior. We have something called gender schema theory. Now, schema is a word that is going to come up over and over and over and over and over again. So a schema is a framework for thinking. Think of it's your organization, your filing cabinet in your brain. It's how you put information in and take it out based on the categories. So think of gender, how you see male or female, what that means in your society, your organized thoughts about it. So children learn the concept of gender from their culture, and they adjust accordingly. So Billy falls and scrapes his knee. His mother runs over to comfort him, and he tells her that boys are tough and they don't need kisses. To be fair, you can also give that same message to your daughters. I've told my daughter that, tough girls can dust it off, and she thinks that too. Jill's father and brother are playing catch in the backyard. Her mother asks if she would like to join. She sees them playing catch, but she never sees her mother doing it, so she says she doesn't want to play a boys' game. Well, ladies, if you want your daughter to go play sports or exercise or do things that aren't necessarily always popularly considered female things, be their example. Change their mindset about what it is to be part of that gender. Guys, if you want your sons to be compassionate and caring, let them play with a baby doll. You will be one of those guiding forces about how your kids see the world. And I will tell you, having a son who's a very sweet young man, but also loves to be tough, there's nothing better than seeing him know that it's okay to give his sister a hug when she's sad. because to me that means that when he is 15 and when he's 20 and when he's 30, he will be comfortable with telling people that he cares about, that he's there for them, and that he can give them a hug when they feel sad. And that's the kind of kid I want to have. When we talk about nature versus nurture, time period matters and change does happen. So here we have the activities of married women are best confined to the home and the family. And if you look at back, 1960s, men and women tended to agree. And if you sit there in 1970s, you have the women's rights movement. 1950s, the lines are becoming a lot closer, meaning that over time, environment has definitely changed the way that we perceive these behaviors. So you cannot just sit there and say that they're genetic, that women are better at cooking and cleaning. My husband can push a vacuum just as well as I can, and he can definitely cook food. We have plenty of men that are chefs. So these kind of genetic discussions about certain behaviors, that's just crazy. Sometimes it is environmentally based, and you can see that when you look at nature and nurture issues over time. If they start to come or change and become more aligned with each other, there might be some environmental factor that you need to look at.